Very privileged at this particular hour to have our speaker, Brother BJ Clarke. Brother Clarke was born in Canton, Illinois. He's the son of Ted and Sherry Clarke. Of course, about everyone here knows Ted and Sister Sherry, I think. Of course, Sister Sherry passed on just a few years back. Faithful helpmeet to Brother Ted and a great mother to Brother BJ and the rest of the children. Brother TJ is a gospel preacher as well as an educator of preachers. Brother BJ has followed, I guess you'd say, his steps. At least he was greatly influenced from his father. He's his own man in his own right, so he's not trying to just step in somebody else's shoes. But rather, he does a great, effective work. In September the 24th of 1983, he married his college sweetheart, Sister Tish, who's here with us, and she helps keep him in line and does an effective job. They're a great couple. They enjoy one another's company, or at least it appears so, and and I think it's genuine. I jokingly sometimes say my wife tries to arrange gospel meetings for me just so that we can stay together. But at any rate, but they seem to really enjoy one another's company, and I, of course, appreciate the great helpmeet that I have in the work that we're trying to accomplish. Brother BJ Clarke delivered his first sermon at the age of 9. So he started out rather young, but he began full-time preaching in 1983. He's preached all over this great country and many other places. He, of course, has been very effective at youth rallies, gospel meetings, lectureships. He served congregations in Tennessee and Mississippi and Arkansas. For about 16 and a half years, he preached for the South Haven congregation, which is just across the line from us here. He edited the Power magazine, did an effective job doing that, as well as edited the lectureship book that was put out and is still being put out over there when they have their lectureship each year. Brother Clarke was at one time a member of the adjunct faculty of East Tennessee School of Preaching and Missions. In fall of 2006, he became a member of the faculty here at the Memphis School of Preaching, where he served as instructor and also dean of admissions until 2012. And on January the 1st of 2013, he became director of the Memphis School of Preaching, does an effective job. I don't see how he gets accomplished everything that he gets accomplished, but he does it. And I'm thankful to God for him and his leadership ability. Brother Clarke also directs the Foundations, which is a week-long annual training camp for young people, ages 13 through 19. We have many who come here that week, and that's conducted here on the campus of the Memphis School of Preaching. He's very qualified to preach on the topic, you can plant and water, God will give the increase. Brother BJ.
Before I commence with the message that I'm privileged to give, I want to say a word or two about this event and what it means. It hit me last hour as I was sitting there listening to the message and watching all of the conversions that have taken place that I never remember hearing about any of that on the news, the national news. And it was never spotlighted on any television station. And on this day, and I'm as big a sports fan as there is in this room, I can guarantee you, but on this day, right about this hour, all over the United States of America, there are stadiums packed to the gills with tens of thousands of fans, and there are millions more watching the multiple games on television. And people are going to make some great plays today that will be seen all over on Sports Center and other sports highlight programs. And people will watch it all day long, and I'll be one of them probably later on today. I'll enjoy kicking back in the chair and just relaxing, watching a little football. There's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but let's keep something very much in perspective. The folks who make these great plays today will be forgotten in time to come very quickly as far as the significance of that play. Ask yourself, whatever marvel takes place on the football field today, what eternal impact does it have? It really doesn't have any eternal impact. And so I want to keep in perspective that the real heroes, our real heroes ought not to be the individuals who can throw and pass and kick and tackle. Our real heroes ought to be missionaries and those who are spreading the gospel and doing what they can do to seek and save the lost. What a difference they make and what an eternal impact they're making. I'm so grateful for the way I'm privileged to spend my time this morning and early this afternoon in reflecting upon matters that matter, eternally speaking. Now, I'm not a farmer, but I know this: in order for this field to become like this field, there has to be what? Of course, Brother Bland did such an effective job last night in taking us to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and I just want to briefly notice what it says in this text is necessary for a plant to grow. And of course, there first of all has to be the planting. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse number 6, the Bible says that Paul had planted and Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. But then watch verse 7. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth. They're not the ones who really matter the most in the equation, but God who gives the increase. Now he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. And the question hit me last night as I thought about this. Does what Brother Bland mentioned last night, God gave the increase in the first century, was his topic. My topic is you can plant and water and God will give the increase. So does it still work? The principle that was operative in the first century to bring about growth, does that principle still work today in 2019? Yes or no? Yes. In fact, this principle of planting and watering and increase is true throughout the centuries. And what I want to do very briefly is show you that this concept of planting that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and watering, which he talks about there also in that same text, is going to bring increase, which he discusses very plainly. And it is God that actually gives that increase. And I want to show you that this has always been the case. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 14 and let's notice some planting. There is a situation that has arisen in Genesis 14. Lot has been taken hostage by a group of kings who in conglomeration together have taken Lot and his family hostage. Now, someone needs to plant the seed of thought into someone's mind to rescue them. And so notice in Genesis 14:13, there came one that had escaped, and their name is what? Neither he that planteth nor he that watereth are anything. We don't always know the name of the person who planted something. Have you ever driven by a beautiful area where there are beautiful trees to landscape the property? Do you know the name of the person that planted that tree? Do you know the name of the person that watered that tree and brought it along? Think about all the things that you and I see every day, and we don't have any idea the identity of the person that planted that and kept it going. We know God gave the increase. I don't know the name of the one who planted the thought into Abram's mind that Lot needed help, but I know that planting needed to take place. And then there is the watering. Notice in verse 14 of Genesis 14, when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. And so here is the taking of the planting of the thought and then taking it a step further. Abram could have just let that lodge in his mind and never gone a step further, but no, he watered it by taking 318 of his trained servants, and they went out after Lot and his family. And notice verse 16, here comes the increase. he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, his goods, and the women also, and the people. Someone not known to us planted a thought into Abram's mind, who then took that along with his 318 servants and watered it to the point that God, through his providence, allowed them to bring back Lot and his family. What a marvelous thing. What if the person never had planted that information into Abram's mind? What if he'd never said, or she'd never said what needed to be said? It's so important to just plant the seed and then let it go and see what happens. Now, in 2 Kings 5, let me show you some planting. In 2 Kings 5, there is a Syrian raid that's conducted that captures a little girl out of Israel. As a matter of fact, she is assigned to become Naaman's wife's attendant. She's in charge of taking care of matters that Naaman's wife might need. And so you'll note that in verse number 3, what's her name? What's the name of the little girl from Israel? Neither he that planteth nor he that watereth her. The name does not matter. Neither he that planteth nor he that watereth or anything. No, it's God who gives the increase. This unnamed captive out of the land of Israel plants this thought into the mind of Naaman's wife. Would God, my Lord, were with the prophet that is in Samaria, he would recover him of his leprosy. So there's the thought planted into Naaman's wife's mind. Now what's she going to do with it? Well, it gets watered. You'll notice verse number 4, and one went in and told his Lord, saying, thus and thus said the maid that is of the land of Israel. And the next thing you know, the king of Syria is writing a letter to the king of Israel and asks him to help Naaman with his leprosy problem. And the king of Israel rents his clothes and says, what am I, God? I can't cleanse lepers. The prophet Elisha finds out about it and says, send him to my house. Verse 9, here comes Naaman with his horses. His chariot stands at the door of the house of Elisha. Elisha doesn't even come out. He sends a messenger. This simple solution, go wash in the Jordan 7 times. That's some literal watering. Go get in the water and dip 7 times in the water. And when you come up after the 7th dip, you'll be clean. Naaman doesn't want to do it. He thought there'd be some kind of magical hocus pocus act where the prophet would call on God's name and strike his hand over the infected area and recover the leper. It'd be dramatic. It wasn't going to be dramatic. It was going to be simple. You just go dip 7 times in the river Jordan. He's mad. He wants to substitute his own rivers, hometown rivers of Damascus, Abana, and Pharpar, and he goes away in a rage. Now here's some more watering that takes place. Watch verse 13. His servants came near. Can you tell me their names? How many? I don't know. His servants came near and spake unto him and said, my father, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much rather then when he says to thee, wash and be clean? It's so simple. Why don't you just do it? And now you're about to see the increase. In verse 14, he went down. He dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. Flesh came again like the flesh of a little child. He was clean, but the increase doesn't stop with his physical cleansing. No, it goes beyond that. He returned to the man of God. Verse 15, he and all of his company, he said, behold, now I know there's no God in all the earth but in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. Stop. The little girl from Israel, whose name we don't even know, planted a thought into the mind of Naaman's wife, who then took that thought and passed it on to someone who passed it on to Naaman, who passed it on to the king of Syria, who passed it on to the king of Israel, and then ultimately he ends up at the door of the house of Elisha. Elisha tells him what to do to be cleansed of his leprosy. He doesn't want to do it. His servants come along and influence him to go ahead and do it. He does it. He comes forth clean and then starts believing in God. And it all started with a simple thought planted into the mind of Naaman's wife. And it got watered and it brought forth increase. What a marvelous truth that is. Okay, well, neither he that planteth is anything. Tell me everything you know about Ebed-Melech. A lot of folks would say, I'm sorry, what? I'm sorry, who? Ebed-Melech. You know the famous Ebed-Melech? Well, he may not be famous to us, but in Jeremiah chapter 38, I can tell you this relatively unknown Bible character was one who planted a thought. Here's what happened. In Jeremiah 38:6, they took Jeremiah and put him in a dungeon, and the Bible says they let him down, and verse 6 of chapter 38 says, and there was no water, and Jeremiah sunk in the mire. Now, for what it is worth, Josephus writes in his history that Jeremiah had gotten down to the point where he'd sunken to the point where his neck was just above the mire by the time they got to him. And so this is, if that's true, even if it's not exactly the way it happened, there's no doubt that Jeremiah was in dire straits. He was in great danger. And so notice in verse number 7, now when Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs, yes, this is the Ethiopian eunuch whose name we know, he was in the king's house. When he heard they'd put Jeremiah in the dungeon, he said, well, what is that to me? I've got my own issues to deal with. I'll just leave it be. No, he actually goes to the king in verse 8, and he says in verse 9, my lord the king, these men have done evil in all they've done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they've cast into the dungeon. He's like to die for hunger in the place where he is. There's no more bread in the city. And so here is the planting. Ebed-Melech plants the thought of rescue into the mind of the king, and now we're seeing the watering. Look at verse 10. Then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, take 30 men with thee, take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die. So Ebed-Melech, verse 11, took the men with him. They went to the king's house, and they got some old garments, fashioned them into a rope, threw them down in, and drew Jeremiah by cords out of that pit. And verse 13 says they drew up Jeremiah with cords and took him out of the dungeon. And Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. And do you know that he did a lot of ministry for years, in fact, even decades to come after this? All because why? Someone whose name is barely known to us as a Bible character, Ebed-Melech, planted a thought into the mind of the king, and that got watered. And here comes Jeremiah up out of the pit, and here he writes, he preaches for years to come, he prophesies, and the increase is once again enjoyed. Now, when it comes to the New Testament, we have, even before you get to Acts 2, you come to Mark 2. Any planting going on in Mark 2? Well, here's someone came up with the idea, and we're not told who came up with the idea, but someone planted the thought into the mind of someone who then perhaps planted into the thought of a couple of others. Next thing you know, we've got in verse number 3 of Mark chapter 2, we've got some individuals bringing one sick of the palsy, which was borne or carried by 4. So which one came up with the idea? If we could just get this paralytic to Jesus, his whole world would be changed. If we could just get him to Jesus. I don't know tell me the names of the 4 men that carried this man to Jesus. What are their names? I have no idea. Did they matter to the man that was sick? Yes. Somehow they were going to get him to Jesus. And when the crowd was so thick around the door they couldn't get him to the house, they decided to give up and just say, well, we tried, buddy. Be warmed and filled. We'll be praying for you. Got up on the rooftop, pawed away, tore away until they could get him down. They planted him right into the midst of the room where Jesus was. And what did that planting lead to? Oh, we're about to see some real increase. Their watering took place in taking the original thought and then saying, okay, that didn't work, let's give up. No, let's water it some more. Let's come up with another idea and let's get him there. One way or another, we're going to get him there. And they get him into the midst of Jesus. And look at Mark chapter 2 and verse 5. Look at the increase. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, son, rise and walk. No, not yet. He's going to give him that power, but he says something more important. Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. And of course, this occasioned a lot of criticism. And then Jesus addresses that. And he says in verse 10, that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins. I say, arise and walk. And then verse number 12, immediately he arose, took up the bed, went forth before them all. They're all amazed. They glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. Stop. What if the four men hadn't thought to get this man to Jesus? The thought started, let's get him to Jesus. They had to water it a little bit. They don't give up. They keep nurturing. They get him planted right into the midst of the room. Jesus saves his soul and gives him physical healing as well. And so think about what a difference these four unnamed men made in the life of this unnamed paralytic. He did have a name, and Jesus knew it. And Jesus forgave him and gave him the ability to walk. And then look at the whole crowd got to rejoice and glorify God because of what some smaller group did. The larger group got to enjoy and celebrate. And then here's this example from John chapter 1. We see the planting of the thought. John the baptizer says, behold, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world, John 1:29. But then I'd like to zoom in on the John 1:35 part, because the next day, this happens again in John chapter 1, and look at verse 35. The next day after John stood, two of his disciples were there, and John sees Jesus coming. He says, behold, the Lamb of God. Verse 36, the two disciples heard him say this. He planted the deity of Christ, the thought of the deity of Christ into the minds of these individuals. And how did it, was there any increase? Indeed, there was. You'll notice they started following. And Jesus said in verse 38, what are you seeking? They wanted to know where he lived. He said, well, come and see. Verse 39, they came and abode with him that day. Verse 40, watch it. One of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first finds his own brother Simon, says to him, we found the Messiah, which is being interpreted the Christ. So wait a minute, John the baptizer plants a thought into the minds of two. One of those two is Andrew. He plants that thought into the mind of Peter. And this watering that's already taking place is going to lead to what? You remember that Peter is going to be told in verse 42, thou art Simon the son of Jonah, but you shall be called Cephas, which is by interpretation a stone. And then the day following, Jesus would go into Galilee, find Philip and say, follow me. Philip would then go, and verse 45, plant a thought into the mind of Nathanael, who would then come, and after wondering if any good thing could come out of Nazareth, Philip said, well, come and see. And Jesus saw Nathanael coming, and he said, you're an Israelite in whom there is no guile. And this led to Nathanael in verse 49 saying, Rabbi, thou art the Son of God, thou art the King of Israel. Stop. One statement from John led to this, which led to Andrew bringing Peter, which led to Acts chapter 2. Peter is preaching one of the gospel sermon on the day of Pentecost. At least we have a record of his words. And he with the 11 are making this plain message known. It all started with this Andrew, who's not as well known, doing what he could do. to plant the seed. Now, here's what I'd like to ask you as I start closing out and giving final applications for us today. Okay, we've seen this worked in Acts 2 and in the first century, as Brother Bland showed us last night. God gave the increase in the first century. We've seen it work in Genesis 14 with Lot. We saw it work with Naaman and the little captive maid that planted the thought of his cleansing and what it led to both physically and spiritually for him. We saw it with Ebed-Melech helping to rescue Jeremiah. Start with the thought, water it, and look at the result. We saw Mark 2 that we've got to get this man to Jesus. They finally get him to Jesus, and his world is changed spiritually, physically, all because of unnamed people that cared enough to plant a thought and water it to its conclusion to bring forth a harvest of blessing. And then we see the same thing here in John chapter. But does that still work today? And the answer is yes. In 1970, someone put a flyer in a door in St. Louis, Missouri to advertise the gospel meeting that began the next day. They planted a thought, hoping that maybe the family that was not even present when they put the flyer in the door would pick the flyer up and look at it and maybe at least become aware that there was the opportunity. Well, it just so happens that this family returned from where they'd been on that Saturday morning, found something sticking out of their door, and they thought to themselves, you know what? We've talked about getting in church, the need to get our family into church, and here's a church that cared enough to come right to our door and to invite us. Why don't we go there tomorrow? And so the thought that was planted that day in that door led to the family attending the gospel meeting and a Bible study being set up. And the dad and the mom talk about increase. They become Christians. And later all of the children become Christians. And one of those converts would grow up and become my wife, Tish Clarke. And what is the name? What's the identity of the man or woman or couple or teenager that put the flyer in that door on that morning in St. Louis years ago? Tell me their name so I can thank them, hug their neck and thank them. I have no idea. I want to tell you that God continues to give the increase as my wife plants and waters and teaching Christian wives and ladies, including our wives here at MSOP, ladies' days and things of that nature that she's privileged to do. And by the way, she has threatened me to, within an inch of my life, to remove this picture from these presentations. One reason I like to leave it in, at the moment I took this picture, she was working on a series of slides for me that I use in just about every gospel meeting I'm privileged to hold. She was designing those slides for me, and so I was thinking about her helping to get the word out through that means from a behind-the-scenes sort of way. Tell me, are there still folks out there that are waiting for someone to reach out and plant the thought of God into their minds, yes or no? Are there still people waiting for someone to care enough to say, why don't you come and see us? I know that door knocking is not the number one most effective method of personal evangelism. I'm aware of that. It has some effectiveness, or else it wouldn't be used so frequently by other groups that have used it and grown over the years. But I'll tell you this, if there was only one door ever knocked and only one result, positive result that ever came from it, I would be grateful that it was that door that day, and what a blessing it is. And every place where my wife does any good for God in teaching ladies, does the person who planted that thought that day have any part in that harvest, yes or no? Absolutely. And you know, when I was first married, I listened to a cassette tape of a speaker at a youth rally who told the young people that day a true story, and I got permission to also tell the story, and some of you already know the story, some may not. But it starts with a godly mother in Coleman, Texas, who loved God, whose husband was an elder in the Lord's church there in Coleman, Texas, and they taught their boy, Crockett, about Jesus Christ. And he grew up knowing about Christ because his parents had planted that information into his mind, and they'd watered it, and they'd seen the increase in his own personal conversion to Christ. And then when he grows up and he becomes a part of the Air Force, he meets a sin-sick man who was virtually on the verge of suicide and had tried everything to find happiness except for God and the Bible. And so this 17-year-old teenage boy from Coleman, Texas, sees this sin-sick boy in the Air Force named Joe and says to him, you know, I believe if I were you, I'd start reading my Bible. To which at first Joe ridiculed the concept and thought, the Bible. You would think, okay, planting that one little sentence thought in someone's mind's probably not going to do much, is it? Thousands of miles from here in Okinawa, on the tiny island of Okinawa, about 60 miles long and 12 miles wide, someone utters this simple sentence, you know, I believe if I were you, I'd start reading my Bible. Not much could come from planting that, right? Well, in this case, something did come from it, because Joe starts thinking about it in his bunk at night. You know, the only thing I've really never tried to find happiness, I've tried alcohol, I've tried gambling, I've tried every other thing. I've never tried God, and I wonder if maybe God is the answer. And so he starts attending services with Crockett at the Ojana Church of Christ, and a Bible study is conducted with Joe. And Robert George teaches him the way of God, about the church you read about in the New Testament, the plan of salvation, of believing in Jesus Christ as the Son of God and repenting and confessing and being baptized for the remission of sins. And Joe is baptized and all of his sins are washed away, and he suddenly wants to live rather than kill himself. He has a family back home. He returns to that family back home and falls away from the faith. And then one day on his milk route, as he's taking a wrong turn, it ended up being a right turn in his life, because he drove right by the Elmwood Church of Christ building in Elmwood, Illinois. And when he saw the sign, Church of Christ, his heart leapt inside of him, and he thought, the happiest I've ever been in my life is when I was in the Lord's church doing what the Lord wants me to do. That's the happiest I've ever been in my life. And so he decides that Sunday he's going, and he's taking the family, but the wife won't go. She wants nothing to do with it. So he just decides to take the boys instead. And they come home and sing to Mom and tell her to come with them, and she finally does in the late 1960s, and she's finally baptized into Jesus Christ in the late 1960s, and her soul is saved. Stop. Did the teenage boy who said something to the suicidal Joe have anything to do with the conversion of this woman he'd never met, who lived thousands of miles away from him? Did he start a chain reaction? Was there any watering? Was there any increase? Now it's not just Joe's salvation, it's his wife's. And Joe starts doing some Wednesday night devos at the local church there, and then the preacher from that local church comes back and says, Joe, there's a place in Memphis, Tennessee that offers tuition-free education for becoming a gospel preacher. And you can go there and you can study, and you just have to have enough support to live on, but you don't have to pay anything for the classes. And Joe decides that he will enroll in the Memphis School of Preaching. And on June the 25th of 1972, Joe walks across the stage to receive his diploma and is awarded by the faculty the award as the most outstanding student of his graduating class. And how did he get from being on the verge of just wanting to end it all to now ending this moment in his life when he is graduating and receiving this high honor? How did that happen? What good could it do to simply say, you know, I think if I were you, I'd start reading my Bible? What could that possibly lead to? Well, it led to this, which really, if you think about it, Audie Crockett teaches her son, Joe Crockett, about Christ, plants that in his mind along with Daddy. Aubrey teaches Joe as well, Joe Crockett. Joe Crockett goes to Okinawa years later and teaches Joe Clarke about the gospel of Christ. And Joe Clarke takes that home to his wife, Sherry, and they end up passing it on to all three of their children, Brad, Brian, and Brooke. And the oldest son, Brad, grows up and goes to Freed-Hardeman and decides he wants to be a gospel preacher. And what are the chances that he would be blessed to someday become involved in the work of the Memphis School of Preaching? Because a teenager, thousands of miles from this spot, a teenager thousands of miles from here, plants a thought into the mind of my dad, that there is hope and you don't have to live in despair. What could possibly come from just a simple sentence? When the gospel's behind it and when Christ is behind it, never underestimate the power of a simple sentence. There is so much that can come from it. And you think about the blessings that my dad has had to be a trainer of preachers at the Bible Institute of Missouri, where he used to work, and here at the Memphis School of Preaching over the years as he has filled in and taught and instructed as well. And then, you know, we named our son Michael Joseph Clarke after Joseph Crockett, who helped to convert my dad. And I have the privilege of working with young people every year at Foundations. And this is Foundations in the early years. And now it's just the seed that was planted that started this whole thing has continued to be watered, and it's increasing. And we have, a couple of years ago, just a few years ago, we had 227. This is one of the earliest years where we had just a few, but the boy right in the middle of this picture, Tate Williams, is now passed on to his reward, as some of you know. But he loved Foundations. And we had this contest where whoever preached the most effective sermons that week would then be banquet speakers at the end of the week. And I'll be honest with you, the first time I ever heard Tate, I thought to myself, you are grown and you're just, hiding it. There's no way you can preach that well at that age. But he was planning on coming to the Memphis School of Preaching. He'd already received a $3,000 scholarship sent to us to await his arrival, 3 years coming. And then he was headed to deliver his very first gospel meeting sermon and was hit by an oncoming car and unfortunately did not survive. After fighting for some time, he was not able to overcome it, and he passed into eternity. The month before he died, he saw me in Cleveland, Tennessee, and came up for the gospel meeting I was conducting there, and he said, "Are you going to preach this week about whatever happened to Joe?" And I said, "I wasn't planning on it." He said, "Would you please?" I just love hearing that because it tells me what a young person can do and the difference they can make. "Would you preach that this week?" And I agreed to. And it was, again, a month later that he tragically passed from us. And I remember sending the check back to those who had sent it on his behalf with tears streaming down my cheeks, as he was never able to realize the goal of preaching. But he still lives by his example and by his life. And when when we're able to do any work that we do for God, whether it's here at MSOP or over satellite television through GBN or whatever, I never forget that Joe Crockett, the teenage boy in Okinawa, started this whole chain reaction. And I know some of you may not know about it because you're new to MSOP, but about 6 weeks before Joe Crockett was scheduled to be married, he left his fiancee's home, and the car he was driving hydroplaned on the wet conditions, and his car went hurtling through the air and smashed head on into a tree. And he didn't die, but he was rendered a quadriplegic, paralyzed in all 4 limbs. His fiancée said, "I will still marry you when you get out of the hospital." And he said, "I won't let you. I love you too much to let you. I can't provide for you. I can't give you children. I can't do the things that you need for a man to be able to do for you. And so I set you free with my blessing and my prayers." Just about 2-3 weeks ago, I just so happened to be preaching in Coleman, Texas area where he lived all those years. And it struck me that in this very area where I'm privileged to be this week, there were some things being planted in the mind of a young man who would then grow up and go thousands of miles from this spot and plant those same thoughts into the mind of another young man who would then someday plant those thoughts into me. And now every time I teach and preach God's word, I get to plant the gospel into the hearts of men and women. And it's watered by others who do the teaching, and then God gives the increase. I say this as I close. The family photos of many people that you and I know may be awaiting an adjustment for the future. Because as I look at the family photo and think about, hey, why is it that the folks in this photo are able to be Christians, to grow up to become Christians? I can trace it back to the planting and the watering and the giving of the increase by Almighty God. Indeed, you never know when you teach your baby boy about Jesus, who he's going to grow up and teach about Jesus later on. You never know. You don't know how far-reaching that will go. Friends, I'm so thankful today to say you can plant and water. God still gives the increase, but that raises this very thought-provoking question. God still gives the increase, but who among us will plant and water? I ask myself, have I ever said to someone what someone said to my dad that made this all start happening? And if not, why not? I need to at least plant those seeds. Not everyone that hears them will go out and become a Christian and a gospel preacher and have boys and grandsons who become gospel preachers. No, but I'm telling you, this word will do its work. Think about it as it relates to you. Who planted and watered the seed that brought about your conversion? And will you and I go out and be that same planter and waterer for others in years to come?